The door of the Ascension test capsule was about to close when Song Shuangshu saw Gu Jinghong's face for the last time. That face, framed by the round glass of the porthole, was lit from within the capsule by the morgue white emergency lights, turning it into something carved from the finest mutton fat jade. Gu Jinghong wasn't wearing a helmet. Her long hair floated weightless around her head, like the tendrils of some deep-sea predator. The corner of her mouth was curved upward at a precise, calibrated angle. Not quite a smile. It was release. She raised her right hand, fingers together, and gave him a goodbye gesture. Not a wave. The kind of hand signal a surgeon gives a nurse at the end of an operation. We're done here. Close up. Song Shuangshu's back slammed against the capsule wall. The 12 main engines of the Ascension test capsule ignited simultaneously. The acceleration hit him like a press, flattening him in an instant. His 9th thoracic vertebra shattered in a burst fracture. 8 ribs snapped. His spleen ruptured. His left kidney was impaled by a splinter of bone. More than 3,000 milliliters of blood hemorrhaged into his abdominal cavity. A thin layer of frost had formed on the metal surface of the capsule wall. When his blood sprayed across it, it froze into dark red ice crystals. He didn't die. The capsule's buffer system triggered its emergency protocol at the last possible moment. Code he had written himself. The 12 engines cut off in sequence, and at 32 meters above the ground, the capsule ejected a drogue chute. He was still conscious when they hit the East China Sea. Seawater poured through the shattered hull, saltbitter and freezing. He sank with his eyes open, watching the daylight dim through the cracked porthole, feeling like a stone dropped into a deep well. That was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, he was the chief propulsion scientist of the China Deep Space Exploration Program, the chief architect of the Ascension nuclear fusion engine. Gu Jinghong was the protégé he had raised from graduate school. He had taught her, hands-on for 7 years, from one-dimensional isentropic flow calculations to plasma instability analysis, from the first rough sketches to the ignition test of the first prototype. She learned too fast, so fast that everyone said Professor Song had struck gold. So fast that every time Song Shuangshu clapped her on the shoulder after a technical breakthrough, he missed the light that flickered and vanished in her eyes. It wasn't pride. It was hunger. He discovered the data anomaly 3 minutes before the test capsule ignited. Someone had tampered with the underlying parameters of the engine control sequence. The change was microscopic, 3 bytes, just enough to create a 0.3-second phase discrepancy in the ignition sequence of the 12 engines. 0.3 seconds in astrodynamics is enough to turn a controlled ascent into a free fall. The parameter change was made using his permissions, his terminal, his biometric signature. There was only one person who could have done that. He burst into the control room 90 seconds before ignition. Gu Jinghong was sitting alone at the master console. The countdown clock on the screen was pulsing red. She turned to look at him, utterly calm, as if she had been expecting him. He asked her why. She said, "Professor Song, you've been standing in front of me for too long." Her voice was as soft and even as ever, carrying the trace of a Jiangnan accent, as if she were asking him a technical question in the lab. Deep space exploration doesn't need 2 gods. One is enough. Please step aside gracefully. I'll finish the ascension for you under my name. The capsule door locked. The engines ignited. Her face vanished behind the porthole. The night Song Shuangshu sank into the East China Sea. Beijing was holding a celebration gala. News of the successful ignition of the Ascension fusion engine had swept the globe. Gu Jinghong, as the newly appointed chief engineer of the project, stood under the spotlight in the Great Hall of the People. She wore a dark navy pantsuit. The nameplate on her chest read, Gu Jinghong, Ph.D., Chief Engineer, National Deep Space Program. She said this was a gift dedicated to her mentor, Professor Song Shuangshu. Professor Song, she announced, had been forced to withdraw from the front line due to illness on the eve of the project's critical phase, and had entrusted all technical materials to her. She bowed to the cameras, eyes glistening, and said, "Professor Song, rest assured, the Ascension will fly." The audience erupted in applause. No one knew that Song Shuangshu was at the bottom of the East China Sea, being circled by a school of silver pomfret. 10 years later, Jiuquan, Gansu Province, Dongfeng Space City. In the northwest corner of the launch complex, There was an inconspicuous welding shed. Corrugated iron walls, an oven in summer, an icebox in winter, drafty and leaky, with the single virtue of sitting close to the launch tower. So close the whole shack rattled every time an engine test fired. The shed was crammed with welders of every kind, heat, plasma, laser, friction stir. Dozens of welding torches hung on the walls, the ceramic nozzles on each one worn to a high shine. A hand-painted price sign stood by the door, the lettering as precise as if drawn with a vernier caliper. * Precision welding services available. Welding of aerospace ground support equipment requires certification. Engine component welding not accepted. * The shed's owner was named Jiang Bian. Everyone at the launch complex called him Jiang the Mute, because he barely spoke 3 sentences a day. From dawn to dusk, he crouched next to his welder, auto-darkening hood down, feeding wire with his left hand, working the torch with his right. Weld seams trailed out from under his hands, straight, uniform, smooth as if drawn with a ruler. The apprentices in the shed had secretly measured his welds. They ran ultrasonic flaw detectors over them again and again. No porosity, no cracks, no incomplete fusion. Penetration depth deviation from end to end. No more than 0.02 millimeters. An apprentice posted the NDT report on an internal aerospace forum with the title, "Take a look at what that mute welder at Dongfeng can do." The thread got over 2,000 replies. The most popular comment came from a verified account. A veteran welding engineer at CSC. He wrote 4 characters. Divine craftsmanship. Jiang Bian never engaged. He opened the shed at 5 every morning, closed at 8 at night, welded 12 hours a day, and charged anywhere from a few dozen to a few hundred yuan. What he earned was just enough to rent a 300-square-foot single room in the complex's family housing and cover 3 meals a day at the cafeteria. No one knew his past. No one noticed that after every job, he would jot down a string of strange symbols in a notebook. Symbols that looked like fluid dynamics equations but weren't. Symbols that resembled plasma simulation data but were more complex. Over 10 years he had filled more than 50 notebooks, each sealed in an anti-static foil pouch and locked inside an explosion-proof case under his bed. If you pieced those symbols together and translated them into the language of aerospace propulsion, you'd get a complete deep space propulsion architecture. It was based on a fundamentally new paradigm he called bimodal plasma confinement, using alternating magnetic fields to construct dynamic confinement layers within the plasma flow, synchronously compensating for instability growth, pushing the specific impulse of a fusion engine past existing theoretical limits, while simultaneously reducing the plasma's thermal load on the engine walls to a level materials could survive. This architecture bypassed all existing nuclear fusion propulsion pathways' reliance on superconducting magnets and inertial confinement. It solved, from the base logic upward, the energy dissipation problem caused by plasma turbulence in high-specific impulse engines. It was called Ascension 2.0. Its predecessor was simply Ascension. 10 years earlier, when Song Shuangshu first sketched the original architecture in his Beijing lab piled high with scratch paper, Gu Jinghong had been a first-year grad student who couldn't yet fully derive the fundamental equations of magnetohydrodynamics. It was Song Shuangshu who plucked her from a stack of self-nomination letters. He spent 7 years teaching her everything hands-on, from basic plasma spectroscopy diagnostics to the most complex nonlinear turbulence simulations. Gu Jinghong learned fast. So fast the entire lab began to believe China's deep space aspirations were within reach. Everyone said so. They said it too much. Jiang Bian lifted a finished titanium alloy flange to his eyes, inspecting the fish scale pattern of the weld under the fluorescent light. The reflection in his hood stretched his own face into a distorted phantom. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. Only he knew that the titanium alloy scaffold inside his thoracic vertebrae was itching. The wind and sand in Zhouchuan had been heavy lately, the barometric pressure swinging wildly. Every time the pressure dropped, the scaffold reminded him with perfect reliability, * you are still alive. * embedded in his spine were 8 screws and 2 titanium rods. Every time he bent over to weld, every time he crouched to inspect a seam, he was pushing his skeleton to its absolute limit. And yet he crouched next to that welder every single day, because the forward-leaning posture reduced the pressure inside his spinal canal, a physical analgesic he had designed for himself. using one pane to suppress another. The old TV in the shed was playing a special report on CCTV News. On the screen, the Wenchang Space Launch Center on Hainan Island blazed with lights. Under a golden banner reading Tianwen Program, Ascension Engine officially commissioned, Gu Jinghong stood in a crisp dark blue aerospace uniform. The insignia on her chest read, Chief Engineer, National Deep Space Exploration Program. She stood at the podium before the launch tower. Behind her loomed the Long March 12 heavy-lift rocket, 120 meters tall. Four enormous red characters were painted on its flank, Heart of Ascension. The giant screen behind her played an animated demonstration of the Ascension engine, a brilliant blue arc of plasma tail blazing through deep space. Gu Jinghong spoke into the camera in fluent English. A decade ago, when I saw the first successful plasma confinement diagnostic data for the Ascension engine in the lab, I knew the history of human deep space exploration was about to be rewritten. Traditional chemical propulsion can only take us to Mars. Ascension can take us to Proxima Centauri. This is the paradigm shift from the propellant age to the fusion age in space propulsion. Applause thundered. In the front row sat a young man in a sharply tailored dark gray suit, a gold aerospace pin on his lapel. He was Gu Jinghong's husband and the executive deputy director of the Ascension project. His name was Lu Xingye. He was also the college roommate of Song Shuangshu's son, Song Tingyun. Yes, he was Gu Jinghong's husband, and the roommate of her mentor's son. The web of connections was so tangled that the old guard in the aerospace system had drawn multiple iterations of relationship charts just to map it out. Back in the day, Song Tingyun had brought Lu Xingye home for dinner. Gu Jinghong happened to be at Professor Song's house, briefing him on her research progress. The first time Lu Xingye saw her, she was sitting in Song Shuangshu's study, working on her laptop, processing experimental data. She looked up and smiled at him. Later, Lu Xingye became Gu Jinghong's most steadfast supporter inside the aerospace establishment, shielding her from the endless skepticism of Song Shuangshu's old colleagues. During the applause, Lu Xingye tilted his head and exchanged a glance with Gu Jinghong on stage, a subtle curve at the corner of his mouth that only they understood. The live broadcast cut to a close-up of him. A reporter asked, Deputy Director Lu, as co-lead of the Ascension team, how do you respond to external doubts about the origins of this technology? Lu Xingye's smile was polished and practiced. The logic of the doubters is always the same. You're too young, so you're unworthy. You're too fast, so you must have stolen something. But aerospace engineering does not lie. The Ascension engine has passed the CNSA's certification review. It will be installed on the Long March 12 for its first deep space flight test by year's end. The specific impulse numbers, the thrust curves, the plasma confinement efficiency, all verified through hundreds of ground test firings. This is something no doubter can refute. The reporter pressed. I understand your wife's former mentor also worked in aerospace propulsion and later had an accident? Lu Xingye's smile faded just enough to register a note of carefully measured reverence. Yes, Professor Song is a predecessor we will always hold in the deepest respect. He did conduct some early-stage explorations for the Ascension engine, but later withdrew from the front line due to illness. Jinghong has always said that the success of Ascension is the best tribute we can offer Professor Song. He said withdrew from the front line due to illness, with the natural ease of someone stating a universally known fact. And indeed it was a universally known fact for 10 years. The sole mention of Song Shuangshu in the aerospace program's official documentation was a single line. Former chief designer of the Ascension project, withdrew from the critical phase of the project due to health reasons, passed away the following year. Gu Jinghong had personally penned the eulogy, which stated that he died of illness in Beijing at the age of 51. No one verified it. No one could. By the day after Song Shuangshu sank into the East China Sea, a complete set of death certificates and cremation records had been laid over his entire existence. Gu Jinghong did clean work, as clean as her plasma confinement models. Zhang Bian placed the finished flange into the ultrasonic cleaning tank for 10 minutes, lifted it out, dried it with a lint-free cloth, applied an antioxidation protectant, and sealed it in an anti-static bag. He wrote a string of symbols in his notebook, assigned it a number, and locked it in the explosion-proof case. Then he lifted his hood, stood up, and stretched his stiff thoracic spine. The titanium scaffold emitted a faint friction sound, like someone in the distance tightening a screw. He pulled out an old satellite phone and dialed an encrypted number. A young woman's crisp voice, tinged with a northwestern accent, answered. Old Jiang. I've pulled the entire Ascension engine supply chain data. The superconducting tape they're using to manufacture the plasma confinement coils. The spec sheet says it can handle a 25 Tesla magnetic field. But the actual critical field of the delivered batches is only 19.5 Tesla. The supplier's factory inspection reports were altered. The third-party testing agency that falsified the reports? The beneficial owner is Liu Xingye's cousin, which means under full power operation, the Ascension engine's confinement coils could quench at any moment. If the coils quench, the plasma confinement field collapses in a fraction of a second, and the reactor chamber turns into a miniature sun. Asterisk. Zhang Bian was silent for a moment. The young woman's name was Zhu Xing. He had met her in Jiuquan 5 years ago. Back then, she was a materials science grad student at Northwestern Polytechnical University, running irradiation experiments on superconducting materials at Dongfeng Space City. Her experimental apparatus had malfunctioned, and in desperation she'd asked around for help until a security guard pointed her toward Zhang Bian's welding shed. The guard's logic was simple. Something broke? Go find Zhang the mute. He can weld anything. Zhang Bian spent an afternoon fixing her equipment, not by welding, but by recrimping a few poorly contacted connectors. Zhu Xing squatted beside him the whole time. When he finished, her first words were, "You weren't always a welder." Zhang Bian didn't answer. Second sentence, "You worked in aerospace." He still didn't answer. Third sentence, I don't care who you used to be. I need your help. I'm investigating quality issues in the Ascension engine supply chain. I've already dug down to the third-tier suppliers. I can't go any further alone. Zhang Bian looked at her for a long time. Then he spoke his fifth sentence of the day. Show me the data. Over 5 years, Zhu Xing had become his only ally in Jiuquan, a mute welder and a materials science grad student. A partnership that worked surprisingly well. After graduating, Zhu Xing didn't take any job. She walked straight into Zhang Bian's welding shed and became an apprentice, officially learning to weld, while her laptop held every shred of data on the Ascension project's supply chain, from Tier 1 down to Tier 5, dug deeper than a national audit. That's enough, Zhang Bian said, beginning to pack up. He hung each welding torch in its place, pulled on the dust covers, movements unhurried but precise to the millimeter, as if he were assembling an engine. Notify Yin Chuan. Launch the short. And send the original test data for that batch of superconducting tape, along with the before and after comparison of the altered reports, anonymously to the CNSA Quality and Reliability Center, the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection's Aerospace Division, and the editorial board of the Journal of Astronautics. Route it through the dark web via Moscow. Zhu Xing said, already working on it. One more thing. Gu Jinghong is holding the Ascension engine's commissioning press conference in Jiuquan next week. It's a big production. They've invited Central Military Commission leadership. Choosing Jiuquan, is she probing? Does she suspect you might be here? Zhang Bian pulled the plug on the last welder and wiped down the workbench with a rag. His fingers left 5 clean streaks on the surface. Whether she's probing or not, Jiuquan is my home ground. 10 years of wind and sand. It's time she heard it. 1 week later. Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center. On the Gobi at dusk, the setting sun rusted the entire launch complex. The integration and test hall was packed. Hundreds of aerospace experts, military delegates, and media reporters from across the country filled the seats. Gu Jinghong had taken over the entire hall. Suspended above the stage was a scaled replica of the Ascension engine, its housing fabricated from titanium alloy, every weld bead polished to a cold silver gleam under the spotlights. LED strips installed in the nozzle simulated the color of a plasma exhaust plume. A violet-blue light pulsing and flickering, like a star trapped in a cage, beating against the bars. Gu Jinghong wore a custom dark blue aerospace uniform. On her left breast was the gold medal of the National Science and Technology Progress Special Prize. She stood before the engine model and began to speak, her voice meticulously honed, tracing the arc from the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation to humanity's millennial dream of deep space. From the first satellite to the theoretical breakthrough of fusion propulsion, and finally to how she had shouldered the project alone after her mentor's illness forced him to withdraw. When she reached the emotional crescendo, her voice trembled slightly. 10 years ago, when Professor Song left us, he handed me all the ascension data. He told me, Jinghong, I can't continue. Finish this for me. I've carried that sentence for 10 years. She paused, letting the silence curdle in the hall, then added softly, Professor Song, can you see this up there in the heavens? She had rehearsed this line countless times. Every stressed syllable, every place pause, every micro-expression calibrated. Some people in the audience began wiping their eyes. A few young engineers, newcomers to the Ascension project who had joined long after Song Shuangshu had been declared deceased, were red-eyed. Their entire understanding of the legendary chief designer came from Gu Jinghong's meticulously performed tributes. In the third row sat an old man, hair completely white, wearing an old-model aerospace work jacket with no medals on his chest. He was Song Shuangshu's old partner, the first head of plasma physics for the Ascension project. His name was Wen Jiuzhang. He was 73. When Gu Jinghong delivered her line, Wen Jiuzhang didn't wipe his eyes. He just sat there, folding and unfolding an old cap printed with the words China Aerospace, over and over again. Just as Gu Jinghong raised the remote to play the simulation video of the Ascension engine's deep space test, every light in the integration and test hall went out simultaneously. It wasn't a circuit breaker. The engine model also went dark, yet the red aviation obstruction lights on the launch tower outside were still blinking. Only this hall. The emergency lights didn't come on. Every electronic screen turned black. People screamed in the dark. Some pulled out their phones and found they were dead too. The blackout lasted about 30 seconds. Then, across the gobi on the launch tower, the gigantic LED screen normally used to display mission countdowns blazed to life. The tower was 120 meters tall. The LED screen was mounted on its midsection, usually reading things like Tianwen-3 launch, T-XX days, XX hours, XX minutes. Now the entire screen turned pure white, and on that white a line of black text materialized. The font was the standard monospace used in aerospace telemetry software, cold and clinical, as if captured directly from a console terminal. Gu Jinghong, do you remember how the door of the Ascension test capsule closed? Gu Jinghong's hand froze in midair. The remote slipped from her fingers, bounced off the stage, and skittered into the nozzle of the engine model, catching among the LED strips. It pulsed a faint blue glow off and on. The tower screen continued. 10 years ago, in the Ascension test capsule at the Beijing Institute of Aerospace Propulsion, you altered 3 bytes, locked the capsule door, and hit ignition. You thought I died. I didn't. Today, I'm here to take back what you stole from me. This isn't revenge. It's a reset. You let the world run on a nuclear fusion engine with falsified base parameters for 10 whole years. Every fellow researcher misled by your fraudulent data. Every space program that chose the wrong technical path because of your lies. Every ground test crew member who died in a plasma confinement failure accident. All of it is on you. The auditorium exploded. Reporters lunged for their phones to take pictures, only to find the screen still dead. A signal jammer blanketed the entire hall. Several people rushed to the windows, pressing their phones against the glass, trying to capture the image on the tower screen. But through the double-pane blast-proof glass, the cameras couldn't focus. Outside, the text on the tower screen burned cold in the gobi night, each character 3 meters tall, visible from every corner of the launch complex. Engineers on the night shift at the tower pulled out their phones and recorded. The videos tore through internal aerospace group chats like wildfire. Gu Jinghong spun toward backstage, hissing into the concealed microphone on her collar. Cut the power to the tower screen. This is defamation. Kill the power. Her voice traveled through the mic to the backstage control room. No one answered. The control room's lights were dark too. Every button sat mute as a stone. Zhu Xing had already remotely locked down the tower screen control system permissions. The screen began displaying its first document, the original patent application archive from the National Intellectual Property Administration. Inventor, Song Shuangshu. Title, a high-specific impulse nuclear fusion propulsion system based on bimodal plasma confinement. Filing date, May 17, 10 years ago. 3 days later, Song Shuangshu was ignited and ejected in the Ascension test capsule. Then, a second document. An internal email from the Institute of Aerospace Propulsion. Sender Gu Jinghong. Recipient. Archive Room Administrator. Date. The day after Song Shuangshu's accident. The body of the email was a single line. * migrate all of Song Shuangshu's experimental data, design drawings and simulation models to my name. Seal the original records. Overwrite the electronic files. Notify the project office that the technical lead has been changed to me. * The third document was an audio file. Gu Jinghong's voice with the countdown broadcast from the capsule control room audible in the background, as clear as if recorded yesterday. * Professor Song, the final lesson you taught me. I've learned it now. Space propulsion doesn't need two gods. One is enough. Please step aside gracefully. I'll finish the ascension for you under my name. And by the way, that bimodal confinement algorithm you taught me? I ran the full simulation last month. It's 0.3% more efficient than your original design. Did you feel gratified? Your student finally surpassing you? Truth is, I could have surpassed you a long time ago. You just kept standing in the way. As long as you didn't leave, I could never break through. Song Shuangshu had recorded it himself. During their confrontation in the control room before the capsule ignited, his satellite phone had been in his pocket, voice recorder running. The phone was destroyed when he was blasted into the sea, but Yan Chuan, the man who had been Song Shuangshu's classmate at the Aerospace Academy 30 years ago, now the manager of the world's largest energy hedge fund, Abyss Capital, recovered the data from the memory chip by technical means. The first time Song Shuangshu listened to the recording, he was silent for a long time, not because of rage, but because he noticed the tone in Gu Jinghong's voice when she said, 0.3% more efficient. It wasn't pride. It was grievance. The deep, festering grievance of someone who felt she had been held back for too long. A genius who believed she had been suppressed by another genius for so many years that even a 0.3% improvement had to be proven with murder. In the audience, an old expert shot to his feet, his trembling finger aimed at the stage. It was when Zhou, Song Shuangshu's old partner, the first head of plasma physics for Ascension. He had been sitting there the whole time, listening to Gu Jinghong's maudlin eulogy, force-feeding her, withdrew from the front line due to illness, lies into his ears word by word. Now hearing this recording, he went rigid as if electrocuted. He opened his mouth to speak, but his hand began to tremble, the shaking spreading from his fingertips to his shoulder. His assistant grabbed him, pulling out fast-acting heart pills. When Zhezhang shoved the bottle away and with every last ounce of strength in his chest, roared at Gu Jinghong on the stage. You, how can you ever face your teacher? His voice wasn't loud, but every word seemed ripped from the deepest cavity of his chest. The entire hall heard it. Gu Jinghong heard it too. Her face went from iron gray to ash white in a single heartbeat. The tower screen displayed the fourth document, a high-definition surveillance video. 10 years ago, Beijing Institute of Aerospace Propulsion, Ascension Test Capsule Control Room. 90 seconds before ignition, Song Shuangshu stormed into the control room, satellite phone in hand, arguing with Gu Jinghong. The body language was violent, Song Shuangshu jabbing a finger at the master console screen, speaking at a rapid-fire clip, clearly demanding an explanation for the 3 altered bytes. Then Song Shuangshu turned to grab a folder from a nearby table. The folder containing the emergency abort procedure flowchart for the test capsule. In the moment he turned, Gu Jinghong's fingers flicked across the touchscreen 3 times in rapid succession. Lock capsule door, bypass safety interlocks, ignite. Her face, as she executed those 3 actions, was utterly serene, as if she were performing a routine operation. Song Shuangshu turned back, saw the countdown had already passed the point of no return, and lunged for the master console to manually trigger the emergency pressure release valve. Gu Jinghong stood up and stepped sideways, clearing a path for him. Not out of conscience. She was giving him room to run into the capsule. She knew Song Shuangshu would rush into the test capsule to save the equipment. His most valuable equipment was all inside. The video captured Song Shuangshu bolting into the capsule. The door locked automatically behind him. Gu Jinghong stood outside the door, watching him through the porthole. The corner of her mouth curved just slightly. 12 engines ignited. The video ended. The video had no sound. But that final expression, the slight curve of Gu Jinghong's mouth, was digitally magnified and projected across the 120-meter tower screen. It wasn't a snarl. It wasn't ecstasy. It wasn't rage. It was relief. The profound, bone-deep relief of someone who has just put down a burden she had carried for far too long. A veteran engineer in the audience, watching that expression, whispered something to the person next to him. The line was later quoted and shared thousands of times. That expression isn't the face of a murderer. It's the face of a successor. To her, murder wasn't murder. It was a handover. Gu Jinghong stood on the stage. Every drop of color had drained from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a ragged hiss came out, like a vacuum chamber leaking atmosphere. Lu Xingye sat in the front row. He was wearing a dark gray bespoke suit, chosen just that morning. He was supposed to join his wife on stage for the media Q&A after the presentation, so he'd picked the most camera-friendly color. His hands rested on his knees, fingers interlaced, knuckles bone white. He wasn't looking at the tower screen. He wasn't looking at Gu Jinghong. He wasn't looking at anyone. He just stared down at his own hands resting on his knees. Lu Xingye had beautiful hands, long, pale, unblemished, the kind of hands that had never done manual labor. Right now those hands were trembling, the tremor entirely beyond his control. He remembered what Gu Jinghong had said to him that morning before they left. Xingye, after today, no one will be able to stop us. He finally understood what she meant. Not after today. 10 years ago. She had already disposed of the person blocking their path, fired him out of a test capsule 10 years in the past. The tower screen didn't stop. After the video, it switched to a side-by-side technical parameter comparison. On the left, the Ascension engine performance specifications Gu Jinghong had publicly published in international aerospace journals. Specific impulse 12,000 seconds, plasma confinement efficiency 94%, thrust density 3.2 meganewtons per square meter. On the right, a set of raw data recovered from the Ascension project's internal test databases. The engine's true specific impulse was only 7,800 seconds, plasma confinement efficiency, less than 70%, thrust density barely half the published figures. The phantom 30% efficiency in the public data had been fabricated during the data migration process. The electronic file overwrite Gu Jinghong had ordered in her email. That was what she had covered over. Even more damning was a small print annotation beneath the table, sourced from the Ascension engine's original design document, signed by Song Shuangshu. It read, Bimodal plasma confinement has extremely low tolerance for magnetic field strength pulsation. Should coil current fluctuation exceed 0.5%, or plasma density gradient exceed 8% of design value, the confinement layer will undergo irreversible collapse. Under such conditions, the engine must not continue operation and should immediately execute an emergency shutdown sequence. In other words, the Ascension engine's operating requirements were brutally stringent. Under controlled ground test environments, it could barely hit its design specs. But in real deep space conditions, with high-energy particle radiation, vibration from micrometeorite impacts, magnetic field perturbations from solar wind, the engine could suffer a confinement collapse at any moment. And Gu Jinghong, in all her public statements, had never once mentioned this limitation. What she had sold was, the Ascension engine has passed all ground test verifications and is qualified for deep space flight. In order to secure national project approval, to secure military procurement contracts, to build her personal monument of glory ever higher, she had deliberately deleted this limitation. She had also conveniently erased the red warning annotation Song Shuangshu had written in the original document. This limitation constitutes the core safety boundary of the Ascension architecture. Manned deep space missions are not permissible until a solution is found. Remember. The assembled aerospace experts in the hall were silent for 30 full seconds. Then an old academician from Tessie rose, unpinned his work ID, and dropped it on the table. A second person followed. A third. The sound of work badges hitting tabletops, in that deathly quiet hall, rang out like gunfire. They weren't enraged that Gu Jinghong had stolen Song Shuangshu's work. That could be investigated, litigated, settled. They were enraged that the entire Chinese aerospace establishment for the past decade had built every single plan around the Ascension engine, the Deep Space Man missions, the Mars base construction blueprint, the Proxima Centauri exploration project on falsified data. It was like continuing to add floors to a skyscraper after 30% of the foundation's rebar had been secretly removed. The higher you build, the more catastrophic the collapse. The deputy chief designer responsible for the deep space vehicle's overall architecture stood up. His voice was shaking. We spent 12 billion yuan building a deep space spacecraft. The propellant tanks, the radiation shielding, all designed for a 12,000-second specific impulse. If the real number is 7,800, that spacecraft can't even break out of Mars orbit. When he finished speaking, no one in the hall said a word. The silence was the kind you hear when a building begins to crack. At that moment, the main doors of the integration and test hall swung open. They weren't kicked in. They weren't shouldered open. A single hand pushed them, steady, moderate, like opening the door to an ordinary laboratory. The man who entered was middle-aged. He wore a faded blue anti-static work coat. Embroidered on the left chest pocket were 4 characters. Zhang's Welding. His frame was lean, his hair cropped short, his temples pure white, so white they reflected the emergency lights. A canvas tool bag was slung over his shoulder, and in his right hand he carried a silver metal case, the standard shielded container the aerospace system uses to transport precision components, still bearing a faded electrostatic sensitive sticker from some lab. He walked down the central aisle. No one stopped him. Every eye in the room was on him. His pace was unhurried, every step steady. As steady as when he welded a circumferential seam on a titanium pipe. Gu Jinghong, who had been struggling to her feet on the stage, saw his face, and all the bones in her body seemed to dissolve. She collapsed again. That face. She had thought about that face almost every day for 10 years. Not with nostalgia. With terror. That face appeared in the anonymous review comments on every technical report she submitted. It appeared in the peer review of every paper she published. It appeared in the nightmare that woke her, drenched in sweat, in the deepest hour of every night. She had even started to feel that face had become a part of her own body, a piece she couldn't excise. In interviews she had called the Ascension engine her child. But only she knew that the child's true father had been living in some corner of her brain all along, watching her in silence. And now that impossible, unremovable piece stood before her in the flesh. Walking in from the wind and sand of the Gobi, walking back from 10 years at the bottom of the sea, wearing a welder's coat, carrying a component-shielded case. Song Shuangshu Jiang Bian stopped in front of the stage. He didn't glance at Gu Jinghong collapsed on the floor. First, he bent down, plucked the remote from inside the engine model's nozzle, and placed it on the lectern. The motion was automatic, like picking up a dropped piece of filler wire at a welding bench. Then he set the shielded case on the lectern and opened it. Inside was a core component of a plasma confinement coil. A toroidal magnet wound from superconducting tape, sheathed in a silver thermal protection layer. This was the heart of the Ascension engine. Each engine required 16 such coils. He took one out and set it on a portable magnetic field tester, retrieved from his tool bag, its housing worn to a sheen, a crack running across the LCD screen. The tester hummed to life, numbers ticking off: magnetic field strength, critical current, quench margin. He let the test cycle finish, then turned the screen to face the audience. This is a coil assembly the Ascension project received from the supplier just last week. It was slated to be installed in the demonstration engine for this very commissioning press conference. According to the magnetic field test results, the critical field of this batch of superconducting tape is only 19.5 Tesla. Not the 25 Tesla on the specification sheet. Which means, under full power operation, this coil assembly will quench. The moment it quenches, the plasma confinement field collapses in 0.03 seconds. The plasma inside the reactor chamber, temperature exceeding 100 million degrees, will flash against the chamber wall. A military delegate in the audience shot to his feet. 100 million degree plasma flash against the chamber wall? Wouldn't that be the equivalent of a hydrogen bomb detonating inside the engine? Song Shuangshu looked at him and nodded. Cleaner than an H-bomb. No nuclear radiation. But the mechanical energy release is equivalent to 2,000 tons of TNT. Enough to tear a manned deep space vessel apart from the inside out. The military delegate's face turned a shade greener than his uniform. He had been dispatched by the General Armaments Department to attend this commissioning ceremony. That very morning, his superior had clapped him on the shoulder and told him to come back with the procurement contract signed for Ascension engines for the Tianwen-4 manned Mars mission. Tianwen-4 was slated to carry 6 astronauts, mission duration 3 years, round trip to Mars. Gu Jinghong slumped on the stage, her lips moving, repeating over and over, "That's impossible. We did acceptance testing on this batch. Impossible." Her voice scaled higher, the final impossible, almost a shriek. Song Shuangshu didn't look at her. He removed a second coil from the shielded case, this one not from the Ascension project. Its shielding layer bore the label, Abyss Fusion Laboratory. That was the research facility he had established overseas with Yen Chuan's capital backing, registered outwardly as a civilian fusion energy company, but in truth dedicated entirely to the correction and iteration of the original Ascension design. He placed this coil into the magnetic field tester. The data ran. Critical magnetic field, 36 Tesla. Safety margin, 44%. Probability of quench under full power operating conditions, less than 10 to the -9. Every parameter crushed Gu Jinghong's coil into the dirt. He turned off the tester and addressed the hall. A fix already exists. This is the Ascension 2.0 confinement coil. Critical field, 36 Tesla. Safety margin over 40%. Plasma confinement efficiency, measured, 97%. Specific impulse, measured, 15,000 seconds. All ground test data has passed independent review by the International Astronautical Federation. Deep space flight test will occur in the next launch window. All data will be released to the global aerospace community in real time. No falsification. No overwriting. No selective reporting. Asterisk. He laid the corrected coil on the lectern, next to Gu Jinghong's coil. The 2 coils looked nearly identical, silver toroidal magnets, indistinguishable under the lights. But one was a lie. One was the truth. Asterisk. The one on the left is what you stole. The one on the right is what I'm taking back. Compare them yourself. Asterisk. The hall was absolutely dead. Gu Jinghong knelt on the stage floor, staring at the 2 coils placed side by side. Her lips were still moving but no sound came out. Then her right hand began to tremble. Violently. The 5 fingers twitched and jerked beyond her control. Someone in the audience murmured a word, tremor. It was the occupational disease of someone who has spent too long operating precision instruments, hand tremor. But when it manifested under such colossal psychological shock, it indicated a deeper breakdown. A functional tremor, originating from the collapse of the central nervous system's protective inhibition. Gu Jinghong clamped her left hand over her right, pressing down with all her strength, but the right hand kept shaking, like an overloaded servo motor oscillating wildly on the edge of control. Song Shuangshu looked at her, looked at those hands he had held, guided, taught 1,000 times, now trembling uncontrollably before him. From his tool bag he pulled out a welding torch, an old TIG torch. The ceramic nozzle was worn paper-thin, nearly transparent. The rubber grip on the torch body had 4 finger grooves worn into it, the depth of the depressions matching the pads of his fingers exactly. Asterisk. Gu Jinghong, do you remember your first plasma welding test? Your hands were shaking so badly you couldn't even strike an arc. I told you then, don't worry about the shaking. Focus on the weld seam. The hands will steady themselves. Your hands are shaking now. It's not a tremor. Your heart is crooked. And when the heart is crooked, the hands can never be steady. Asterisk. He placed the welding torch on the lectern, next to the 2 coils. 3 objects in a row, 2 coils, 1 worn shiny old welding torch. A silent exhibit. Then he turned and walked toward the door. At the threshold he stopped. He didn't turn around. Lu Xingye's entire body jolted. His hands slid from his knees, fingers curling into fists at his sides and then loosening again, over and over. Song Shuangshu's voice came from the doorway, calm, as if remarking on the Gobi wind. Tingyun has his doctoral defense next month. He's at MIT. His research topic is deep learning simulation of plasma turbulence. He's done excellent work. Better than I was at his age. You don't need to attend. And don't tell him you know about me. He has spent the last 10 years believing his father died of an illness in a hospital. Let him keep believing that. He finished speaking, pushed the door open, and vanished into the moonlight flooding in from the gobi. He had called him Tingyun Song Tingyun, his son. 10 years ago, when Gu Jinghong fired him out of that test capsule, Song Tingyun had just started his freshman year studying physics. He spent 2 years trying to investigate the truth of his father's accident, poring over every public incident report, visiting everyone who might have had inside knowledge, until he was finally told. Control system malfunction in the test capsule caused an erroneous ignition. Chief designer Song Shuangshu died in the line of duty. He didn't believe it. But he couldn't find a single piece of evidence. 2 years later, he switched his major to aerospace propulsion and fought his way into MIT's plasma physics program, using his own path to reconstruct the life's work of his father. Now, he was a PhD candidate, working on next-generation plasma confinement algorithms for the Ascension engine. He didn't know his father was alive. He didn't know that every semester, an anonymous foundation paid out a Song Shuangshu Memorial Scholarship into his account, money scraped together entirely from the wages of a welder named Jiang Bian. He didn't know that his doctoral advisor, the director of MIT's Plasma Science and Fusion Center, received anonymous manuscript reviews, and the eerily precise technical suggestions in those reviews all came from his own father. He knew nothing. Song Shuangshu had decided to let him continue knowing nothing. Some truths are too heavy. Held in your hand, they can buckle a person's spine. He was already a bone that had been broken. He didn't need his son to become one too. Almost simultaneous with Song Shuangshu walking out of the integration hall, the global aerospace community and the capital markets detonated. The video of the tower screen from Gu Jinghong's press conference, recorded by a duty engineer on the launch tower, spread exponentially through internal aerospace group chats. The first person to post it to public social media was a Beihang University grad student interning at Jiuquan. His caption, "Holy shit, the launch tower screen just got hacked and it's spilling all the dirt on the Ascension engine's chief engineer, murder from 10 years ago," something like that. The post was retweeted over 2 million times in 15 minutes, then deleted. But it was already too late. Screenshots and recordings had already propagated across every global aerospace forum and investment community. Ascension's publicly listed entity, Jinghong Aerospace Technology Group, went into free fall on the star market within 90 seconds of the video appearing. The circuit breaker tripped again and again, shattering historical records. Hong Kong was worse. Jinghong Aerospace 8 shares collapsed over 90% in 2 hours. All the short sell orders on Jinghong Aerospace, from every corner of the globe, ultimately converged on a single source, the Cayman Islands. Abyss Capital. Yin Chuan sat in the windowless trading room in the Caymans, facing a wall of monitors. In front of him were 2 objects: a cup of pu'er tea long gone cold, and a photograph of him and Song Shuangshu taken 30 years ago, standing in front of the Aerospace Academy gate. In the photo, both wore blue school uniforms, academy pins on their chests, a model of a Long March rocket behind them. Yin Chuan spoke into the phone. His voice was quiet, but it carried the unshakable calm of someone who had survived countless market bloodbaths. Close the positions. Transfer all profits into the Ascension 2.0 R&D fund. After hanging up, he picked up the cold tea, took a sip, and looked at the collapsing stock ticker on the monitor. He smiled. He didn't have a handsome smile. The muscles in his face were too hard. When he smiled, he looked like a rock splitting open a crack. After closing out, Abyss Capital released an open letter to global investors. It was 1 paragraph. We are not making money. We are settling a debt for a man who was robbed of 10 years. This debt has been accruing for a decade. The interest is high. Everything you see on your screens is the sum of the principal plus interest. The letter had no signature. Only a single symbol at the bottom. A welding torch and a pen crossed like a pair of wings. Days later, the China National Space Administration issued an announcement. Effective immediately, all commissioning plans for the Ascension engine were suspended. All manufactured engine components were to be sealed. A comprehensive technical data audit was launched. Simultaneously, the CCDI's Aerospace Discipline Inspection Group announced the formation of a special investigative task force into the technological origins of the Ascension engine. The Ministry of Public Security's Economic Crimes Investigation Bureau joined in parallel, opening a criminal case against Gu Jinghong on multiple charges, including trade secret infringement, experimental data fabrication, endangering public safety, and attempted intentional homicide. The day they took Gu Jinghong away, it was snowing in Jiuquan. The Gobi rarely sees snow, but that day it fell in heavy, dense flakes, covering the launch tower, the glass curtain walls of the integration hall, the scaled replica of the Ascension engine. Gu Jinghong was led out of the backstage VIP lounge by two uniformed military personnel, handcuffs on her wrists. She walked with her head down through the corridor. Reporters packed both sides. Flashbulbs strobed her face into a flickering ghost. As she ducked into the military vehicle, a reporter caught a single photograph, her right hand still trembling, the fine chain between the cuffs shivering with a tiny metallic rattle. That photograph was circulated endlessly. The captions almost all read some version of the same thing. The woman with the shaking hand nearly put 6 astronauts on a one-way trip to Mars. Liu Xingye was intercepted by economic crimes police outside the venue and shown a notice of assistance in investigation. As he was taken away, he didn't look at anyone. Just before climbing into the car, he turned his head once and looked back at the launch tower. The tower screen had long since returned to normal, showing the launch countdown again. Snow settled on the shoulders of his suit jacket, a thin, cold layer. 2 weeks after Gu Jinghong's arrest, CNSA released its preliminary findings on the Ascension engine technical data fraud. The language of the announcement was exceptionally severe, unprecedented in the history of the aerospace system. Preliminary verification confirms that Jinghong Aerospace Technology Group engaged in systematic, long-term falsification of technical data, including fabrication of critical component inspection reports, selective deletion of test failure records, manipulation of engine performance parameters, and fabrication of ground test success rates. The de facto controller of the group, Gu Jinghong, bears direct responsibility for the above illegal acts and is suspected of deliberately orchestrating the test capsule accident 10 years ago in an attempt to murder the original chief designer, Song Shuangshu. The final paragraph stood alone. The China National Space Administration extends its deepest apology to chief designer Song Shuangshu. He is the true creator of the Ascension engine, and the man we have all failed for a decade. That same day, the Journal of Astronautics formally retracted 5 Ascension-related papers on which Gu Jinghong had been corresponding author, using the terms academic fraud and technical crime in the retraction notice. Gu Jinghong's National Science and Technology Progress Special Prize was revoked. Her academician candidacy with the Chinese Academy of Sciences was suspended. Every subsequent review stripped away her academic titles and honors. Her name was taken down from honor walls across the aerospace system, fast like rust being ground off with a sander. At her criminal trial, Gu Jinghong faced charges of attempted intentional homicide, trade secret infringement, experimental data fabrication, and endangering public safety by hazardous means. The most devastating pieces of evidence were a surveillance recording and a DNA analysis report. The recording showed Gu Jinghong at the capsule control console making those 3 touchscreen taps, lock door, bypass safeties, ignite. The DNA report came from a partial palm print on the emergency abort button inside the test capsule. After Song Shuangshu rushed in, he tried to slam the abort button, but Gu Jinghong had already locked the abort sequence out of the system. The button retained his palm print, all 5 fingers splayed, pressing down with his entire bodily force. The depth distribution of the print indicated he had applied over 100 newtons of pressure. 100 newtons. Enough force to blanch an adult man's hand white. He couldn't press it down because Gu Jinghong had already tagged the button as maintenance mode in the system. A physical press would trigger no signal whatsoever. When Gu Jinghong in the defendant's seat saw this evidence, her head, which had been bowed the entire time, suddenly lifted. She stared at the enlarged photograph of the palm print on the screen for a long moment. Then she said something very softly, so softly only the judge and the court clerk in the front could hear. His palm prints were shallow. I remember they used to be so deep. No one knew why she said that. Perhaps she didn't know either. The judge announced the combined sentence. life imprisonment, with deprivation of political rights for life. Liu Xingye was sentenced to 8 years. The prosecution took into account his status as an accomplice in parts of the supply chain fraud, and his cooperation in revealing additional facts, granting a degree of leniency. The day of his sentencing, he stood in the dock in a prison uniform, hair shorn thin. He never once raised his head to look at the gallery. Sitting in the gallery were his parents, 2 elderly people with white hair. Song Shuangshu did not attend the trial. In his capacity as a specially invited expert for CNSA, he had embedded himself in the Ascension Project's final assembly workshop, inspecting every manufactured engine component piece by piece, identifying the parts that carried hidden flaws due to the supply chain fraud, arranging their replacement and retesting. He went over every component, cross-checked every inspection report. For nearly 4 months he tore the entire supply chain apart from Tier 1 to Tier 5. Inside the integration and test workshop at Zhouchuan, Song Shuangshu, wearing an anti-static cleanroom suit, stood beside the assembly rig for the Ascension 2.0 engine, personally directing the assembly of the first corrected unit. He held a torque wrench in his hand, confirming the tightening torque on a bolt to the final degree. The digital readout on the wrench flickered with numbers precise to 2 decimal places. The giant LED screen in the workshop displayed the real-time assembly status of every engine subsystem, from the installation precision of the confinement coils to the helium leak check results of the cooling lines. Every data point uploaded in real time, open to the world, open to the scrutiny of the global aerospace community. Scrolling across the top of the screen was a line of text. * all data released in real time. Global peers are invited to supervise. Any questions, welcome to come to Zhouchuan and watch us assemble. Song Shuangshu had insisted on that line. The workshop director asked him if it was too aggressive. He said, transparency is the best quality assurance. It took me 10 years to learn that. The assembly of the first Ascension 2.0 engine took nearly 2 months. The day it was completed, Song Shuangshu used a welding torch to engrave a tiny line of characters into a corner of the engine housing. So small it was nearly invisible. Song Shuangshu. Zhang Bian. The same man. He etched both of his names onto it, one that had died, one that was alive. He wanted this engine to carry both names into the sky for him. On the day of the engine ground test, the Gobi outside Zhouchuan was packed with people. Representatives from 47 space agencies around the world stood behind the safety perimeter of the test stand, watching through the massive blast-proof glass. As the countdown began, the crowd fell so silent you could hear the wind blowing grains of sand across the Gobi. In the final 10 seconds, Song Shuangshu stood at the control console, his hand resting on the emergency shutdown button. He didn't need to press it. Every safety interlock on Ascension 2.0 was genuine, every data point was measured, every component was qualified. But he kept his hand there anyway. It was a new habit forged over 10 years. Always assume the worst will happen. Ignition. A violet-blue plasma plume erupted from the nozzle, slicing a ruler-straight arc into the Gobi night sky. Specific impulse. 15,200 seconds. Plasma confinement efficiency. 97.3%. Thrust density exceeded design specifications by 8%. Every data point met or exceeded the target. Every safety metric satisfied the requirements for manned deep space flight. The test firing lasted 600 seconds, a full 10 minutes, and then shut down according to sequence. The instant the plume extinguished, a deafening roar of triumph erupted in the control room. The NASA observer stood up and applauded. The ESA chief engineer gave Song Shuangshu a thumbs up. A representative from Roscosmos wrapped him in a crushing bear hug. Song Shuangshu didn't cheer. He simply removed his ear protection, turned, walked to a corner of the control room, pulled that worn old welding torch from his tool bag, and set it on the table. Then he sat down, closed his eyes, and let every sound he had suppressed for 10 years rush in all at once. He heard seawater flooding the capsule hull in the East China Sea. He heard the crackle of a welding arc. He heard Zhu Xing's voice on the phone, data's pulled. He heard Wen Zheozhang standing in that iron shed, the first words he'd said when he found him. I knew you weren't dead. He heard the sentence he had spoken to himself every single night for 10 years. Wait a little longer. It's not time yet. Now the time had come. He opened his eyes, stood, and walked out of the control room. The Gobi night wind hit his face, dry and cold, sand grains stinging his skin. He looked up. The Jochuan sky was very clean. The Milky Way stretched from one horizon to the other. The Ascension 2.0 ground test data was eventually published in the official journal of the International Astronautical Federation under the title, Ascension Engine Correction Architecture Full Condition Test Report. Corresponding author Song Shuangshu. It was the first time in 10 years that name had reappeared in an international aerospace journal. No prefixes, no titles. Just 3 words. The editors noted in their review. The corresponding author appended a note to his manuscript submission. This is the homework I was supposed to hand in 10 years ago. The editorial board unanimously agrees this is the tardiest homework we have ever received. And the finest. Some time later, the complete technical architecture of Ascension 2.0, including the bimodal plasma confinement algorithm, the high-margin superconducting coil design, and the dynamic safety interlock logic, was open-sourced in its entirety. Song Shuangshu registered an account on the world's largest open-source aerospace technology platform under his real name. His avatar was an old welding torch worn to a high shine. The repository description read, **A decade of rust. Welded off. **. After the release, over 1,000 research institutions and aerospace companies worldwide cloned the repository. An aerospace engineer from India posted in the repo's issue tracker, *Our lab doesn't have a superconducting tape winding machine. We only have a manual winding fixture. Yet this architecture actually includes a coil winding guide for low-resource environments that shows how to modify a semi-automatic lathe. I successfully wound a coil with a 30 Tesla critical field in my tiny lab last week. It outperforms any coil I've seen at ISRO. Song Shuangshu replied below. I wrote that guide inside a welding shed in Jochuan. In the gaps between welding jobs, just enough time to think through one thing: good technology shouldn't be picky about people. Or equipment. Months later, the Ascension Charitable Fund was officially launched. Initial endowment: 80 billion yuan. Entirely sourced from Abyss Capital's profits from shorting Jinghong Aerospace. The fund's board had only 3 members: Song Shuangshu, Yan Chuan, and the old man named Wen Zhouzhang. Wen Zhouzhang, after his heart episode triggered at Gu Jinghong's press conference, had spent nearly a month in the hospital. The first thing he did after being discharged was fly to Jochuan. He found Song Shuangshu inside that iron welding shed. The 2 men sat facing each other in silence for nearly 10 minutes. Finally, Wen Zhouzhang said, "I also thought you'd been dead for 10 years, Song Shuangshu said. I thought I could keep it from you for 10 years. Wen Zhouzhang stood, walked to the shed entrance and stood there with his back to Song Shuangshu for a long time. His shoulders were shaking. When he turned around, his eyes were red, but his voice was hard. Count me in on the fund. The 10 years of drinking you owe me, you can deduct it from the fund. The fund exclusively supported 2 categories: aerospace professionals and their families who had been victims of technical fraud, and independent researchers worldwide dedicated to open-source aerospace technology. The sole condition: those who receive help must, when they are able, help another person in need. Song Shuangshu called this clause the redundancy design provision. He said every critical system on a spacecraft has redundancy. Kindness should be the same. There can be no single point of failure in its transmission. Yan Chuan, listening nearby, nodded and said, "Finally, you've given a clause the right name." The very first beneficiary was an elderly woman from a village in Gansu. Her son had been killed 3 years earlier in a ground test accident involving an Ascension engine. The accident occurred on a small test stand on the outskirts of Jochuan. A confinement coil in the test engine quenched after ignition, and the plasma jet punched through the test bay's protective wall. 3 ground test crew members died on the spot. The accident report concluded operator error, and the 3 dead were labeled as having violated operational procedures. The old woman refused to accept the conclusion. For 3 years, she had gone every month to sit outside the space agency gates. A cardboard sign bearing her son's name hung around her neck. She had never received any reply. Song Shuangshu drove to that village personally, carrying the original supply chain data and the forged inspection reports for the superconducting tape, the ones Zhu Xing had dug up. He sat on the old woman's Kong, the heated brick bed, and explained the truth of the accident sentence by sentence. Her son hadn't made an operating error. The coil had been defective from the moment it left the factory. The supplier altered the test report. The quality department on the Ascension project had been paid to look the other way. Her son was innocent. He was a hero. He had paid the price for someone else's greed. After hearing him out, the old woman didn't cry. She stood up, walked to a cabinet, and set a framed photograph on the table. It was her son in his aerospace work suit, standing in front of the test stand, smiling a simple, honest smile. "Can the government clear my son's name?" she asked. Song Shuangshu said yes. He took from his briefcase a document on official red letterhead, the freshly signed CNSA decision on the reinvestigation of historical Ascension engine accidents. He placed the document on the table. Then he stood and bowed to the old woman. She didn't help him up. She simply placed her hand on the document, the way you might place your hand on a child's forehead. Lightly. For a very long time. Later, the Ascension Charitable Fund paid the full tuition for the old woman's granddaughter. The girl tested into the astronautics program at Harbin Institute of Technology, rocket engine specialization. On the day she enrolled, she took a photograph at the school gate and sent it to the man she called Uncle Jiang. In the photo, she was wearing a brand new school uniform, the hit pin on her chest, a model of a Long March rocket behind her. Beneath the photo she had written, "My grandpa says if my dad up in heaven can see me in this uniform, he'd probably smile." Song Shuangshu printed out the photo and pinned it to the tool rack in the welding shed. Next to the photo he placed a frame. Inside the frame, sealed under glass, was a palm print model, lifted from the emergency abort button inside the Ascension test capsule, the only physical trace that proved he had ever truly existed in that accident. The two frames sat side by side. One was the past. One was the future. More years passed. Song Shuangshu's hair went completely white like the alkali flats of the Gobi. He no longer worked the assembly rig himself, focusing his energy on training the next generation of propulsion scientists. His students spread across space agencies in dozens of countries, at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, at ESA's Nuclear Fusion Propulsion Research Center, in the emerging space programs of India and Brazil, serving as technical leads. Every year on the winter solstice he received dozens of emails. Each one followed the same format: a photograph of a student standing next to an engine, and a single line, "Teacher, the XXX test fire of Ascension 2.0 was successful. All data nominal." Song Shuangshu replied to every single one. His reply was always the same. Hand steady? Heart true. Every winter solstice he also returned to Jiuquan. He would stand for a while in front of the old welding shed, which had been converted into the Ascension Engine Memorial. The space agency had voluntarily proposed the memorial. Song Shuangshu objected at first until when Zhejiang called him. "You don't have to build it, but that broken-down shed of yours has been trampled flat by foreign aerospace experts. Last month, a deputy administrator from NASA flew over specifically, squatted next to your welder, and took over 300 photos. Said he was taking them back to show their engineers what true welding craftsmanship looks like." Song Shuangshu finally agreed. The memorial was small, but done with care. Every detail of the old shed was replicated. The wall lined with torches, the ancient welder, the ceramic nozzle worn to a gleam, the workbench pockmarked with 1,000 tiny burn holes from spatter. Everything was original. At the entrance to the memorial hung the original hand-painted price sign, protected under glass. The line "Engine component welding not accepted" had been photographed and shared by countless visitors. A meme inside the aerospace fan community. But few people noticed that in the very corner of the price sign, there was an extremely tiny line of text, magnified by the framer and displayed alongside it. Titanium alloy I can weld. Human hearts I cannot. Visitors who reached this spot usually fell quiet. Even the photographers stopped. They just stood there looking at the words. The memorial's docent, a young aerospace engineer, always paused his narration here, letting people read and think. Someone once asked him who wrote it. He said Master Jiang, no chief designer, Song wrote it. Then he would usually add, Chief designer Song said the hardest thing he ever welded in his life wasn't titanium. It was himself. That winter solstice, the memorial was packed with visitors. Song Shuangshu blended into the crowd, wearing an ordinary blue anti-static work coat, reading glasses on. No one recognized him. He had become very good at blending into crowds by now. Don't straighten your back when you walk, don't stare straight ahead, don't automatically correct people's terminology when they discuss aerospace engineering. He was so successful at it that he could stand inside his own memorial, tour the entire exhibit, and not a single person would make him. He stopped in front of the glass case holding the price sign and looked through the glass for a long time. Then he turned and walked out of the memorial, into the bitter wind of the Jochuan Gobi. The wind on the Gobi was fierce, whipping sand grains painfully against his face. In the distance, on the launch tower, the Long March 12th heavy-lift rocket was undergoing its final pre-launch checks. 4 large characters were painted on the rocket's flank, Heart of Ascension. This was the first deep space launch mission for the Ascension 2.0 engine Tian-15, a manned-Mars orbital exploration mission. 3 astronauts. Flight cycle 2.5 years. Song Shuangshu stood in the wind, looking up at the rocket. The payload fairing reflected a golden light in the setting sun, like a finger pointing at the sky. Footsteps sounded behind him. He didn't turn around, but he recognized Wen Zhezhang's voice. "What are you looking at?" Song Shuangshu said, "Checking if that screw is tightened." Wen Zhezhang followed his gaze and laughed. "You're retired. Still worrying about screws." Song Shuangshu didn't laugh. He really was looking at a screw, the ring of bolts connecting the rocket's first stage to the Ascension engine mount. He'd stood in the assembly bay just yesterday, watching the young engineers torque down the last one, checking every single torque value. When Zhezhang walked up and stood beside him, also looking up at the rocket, they stood shoulder to shoulder in the Gobi wind, neither speaking. After a long silence, Wen Zhezhang said, "That boy Tingyun, are you really not going to let him know?" Song Shuangshu was silent for a moment. After Tian-15 returns. "When she comes back, I'll tell him myself." When Zhezhang glanced at him sideways and said nothing. Song Tingyun's mother, Song Shuangshu's wife, had remarried and moved abroad after Song Shuangshu died of illness 10 years ago. She had always believed her husband perished in the test capsule accident. Song Shuangshu had never corrected that memory. Some truths can wait 10 years, 20 years. But other truths cannot wait. They have to be projected onto a launch tower screen in the Gobi dusk, for the whole world to see. Night fell. The floodlights on the launch tower flicked on in sequence, illuminating the entire rocket until it glowed like a tower of light. Song Shuangshu reached into his pocket and pulled out an old welding torch, the torch that had followed him for 10 years, its ceramic nozzle worn nearly transparent. He lifted it toward the tower lights and rotated it slowly. The nozzle reflected a faint ring of blue light, brighter than it had been 10 years ago. He put the torch back in his pocket and turned, walking deeper into the Gobi. When Zhezhang called after him, "Where are you going?" he waved without turning back. He walked slowly, step by step across the hard gravel of the Gobi. The wind erased his footprints almost the moment he made them. On a rise far from the launch tower, he stopped, alone in the middle of the empty Gobi. Darkness in every direction. Only the Milky Way overhead, rotating in silent splendor. He pulled the torch from his pocket, crouched down and set it on the ground. The Gobi floor was hard. The torch made a soft metallic sound as it touched down. Then he stood, hands in his work coat pockets, and looked up at the stars. The silences and the welding sounds he had learned in the deep sea had, at last, transformed into the engine roar and the heartbeats of a new generation. The plasma plume of Ascension 2.0 would light the darkness of deep space in a few months, carrying 3 human heartbeats toward Mars. One of those 3 astronauts was a woman, 37, the mission commander. Her name was Fang Haiying. Her specialty was plasma propulsion. Her doctoral dissertation was on plasma turbulence suppression algorithms for the Ascension engine, and her entire bibliography was built from the open-source data Song Shuangshu had released. In a pre-flight interview she said, "My engine was designed by Professor Song. I won't let him down." A reporter asked her what she would say if she ever met Professor Song. She thought for a moment. I'd tell him his engine is good. It's very good. Song Shuangshu stood on the gobi for a very long time. The wind died. The dust settled. The space between heaven and earth was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. His heart was steady. 72 beats per minute. Sinus rhythm. No murmur whatsoever. A man who had done thousands of engine tests, his own heart was still running just fine. He lowered his head and looked one last time at the welding torch on the ground. Then he turned and walked back toward the lights of the launch tower. Behind him, the old torch lay silently on the gobi, reflecting the faint blue light of the stars, like a star that had fallen gently to earth. On the day Tianwen-5 launched, Song Shuangshu stood inside the command and control center at the Jiuquan launch complex. He wore that faded blue work coat. He stood among all the uniformed personnel. As the countdown entered its final 10 seconds, his hand rested on the transparent safety cover of the emergency shutdown button at his side. He didn't need to flip it open. But out of habit, he laid his palm against the cover, feeling the cold plastic against his skin. Ignition. The blue-violet plume of Ascension 2.0 erupted from the base of the rocket, lighting the entire gobi. The rocket rose slowly, accelerating, carving a thread of light into the sky that grew thinner and thinner. Inside the control center, cheers exploded. People applauded, embraced, wiped away tears. Song Shuangshu did not applaud. He simply lifted his hand from the emergency shutdown button and patted the safety cover gently, the way you might pat an old friend on the shoulder. Then he turned and walked out of the control center. He stood on the gobi, head tilted back, watching that ribbon of light grow fainter and fainter until it vanished into the dark of deep space. Behind him, his students were flying into the stars. And that was enough.